Every empire believes it is the exception. The British told themselves a uniquely comforting version of that story. They commanded the oceans. They controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. Their language, their laws, their banks, and their flag reached from Canada to India, from Africa to the Pacific. Children were taught that the sun never sets on the British Empire, not as propaganda, but as a simple fact of life. It felt permanent. It wasn't. The collapse of the British Empire did not arrive in a single war or a single speech. It arrived in a long series of quiet trade-offs, financial pressures, political compromises, and moral contradictions that slowly hollowed out the foundations of imperial power. For decades, the system looked stable from the outside. Then, in a surprisingly short span of years, it simply wasn't there anymore. These are 15 hidden facts about that collapse. Not trivia. Not romantic nostalgia. Structural truths that show how slow decay turns into a sudden drop and how an empire can go from setting the rules of the world to asking for permission on its own former territory. Hidden fact 1. The empire was huge. The home base was small on maps. The British Empire looked infinite. Pink or red shaded in vast continents, enormous colonies, shipping lanes wrapped around the globe. But the core of that system was a set of small islands with limited land, limited population, and limited natural resources. Britain's power rested on a narrow base: coal, early industrialization, and naval dominance. That base could project power far, but it could not grow fast enough to match the commitments piling up on top of it. Every new possession, Egypt, Sudan, Malaya, Hong Kong, Nigeria, added responsibilities, costs, and risks, without adding equivalent financial and military depth at home. For a time, efficiency and organization made the imbalance survivable. Over the long run, the math was simple. A small country cannot indefinitely police and subsidize an entire planet. Hidden fact 2. Free trade hid how dependent Britain had become. Empire loved to talk about free trade, open seas, open markets, global commerce under the protection of the Royal Navy. Behind that, there was a more uncomfortable reality. Britain depended on imports for food, raw materials, and even some industrial inputs. Grain, meat, cotton, oil, rubber, metals, all flowed in from colonies and informal spheres of influence. As long as the Navy ruled, that dependence looked like strength. Britain sold finished goods and services, bought cheap raw inputs, and skimmed profits as goods moved through its ports and financial markets. The system looked frictionless, but dependence is still dependence. If shipping lanes were threatened, if rival powers contested markets, if colonial subjects stopped accepting the deal, the home islands had little fallback. What looked like a confident embrace of global trade was also a vulnerability. Britain needed the world more than the world needed Britain. Hidden fact 3. The empire was financed on credit, and the bill came due. 19th century Britain was the world's banker. London's financial markets lent money to railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, governments in India and Canada, and companies working across the empire. Interest payments flowed back to British investors. This created an illusion. The empire seemed to be both profitable and self-financing. War shattered that balance. The First World War forced Britain to borrow on a scale it had never attempted. To pay for guns, ships, and allies, it sold assets and took huge loans from the United States. By 1918, the country that had once been the world's creditor had become one of its biggest debtors. Interest now flowed outward instead of inward. From that point on, every decision about the empire carried a new weight. Maintaining global power was no longer just politically and militarily costly. It was financially unsustainable. The imperial machine still moved, but the fuel was debt. Hidden fact 4. Early warning signs were visible in a small war. The Boer War at the turn of the 20th century looked minor compared to the world wars that followed. British forces against small republics in South Africa. It should have been quick and simple. Instead, it dragged on for years, cost huge sums, and exposed serious weaknesses. The British Army struggled with logistics, underestimated their opponents, and resorted to scorched earth tactics and concentration camps that shocked the world. Casualties and expenses were far higher than expected. Public opinion turned uneasy. For generals and politicians willing to see it, the lesson was clear. Even relatively limited conflicts on the imperial periphery could drain the empire's manpower, money, and reputation. Instead of processing that lesson fully, Britain stored it away and marched into even greater commitments. Hidden fact 5. World War I broke the economic spine. Even before territories were lost, the First World War did not immediately dismantle the British Empire. In some ways, it expanded it, as German colonies were seized and Middle Eastern territories came under British control. On the map, the empire grew. Underneath, the cost was devastating. Millions of men were killed or wounded. Entire cohorts that would have led industry, government, and the military in later decades were simply gone. War spending wrecked the old gold-based financial system. Britain emerged burdened with debt, reliant on American loans, and with a shaken industrial base. The 1920s and 1930s were not a calm imperial plateau. They were a long, bruised recovery that never really caught up. The empire still looked impressive, but the center was weaker than it had ever been. Hidden fact 6. The interwar empire survived by cutting its own. Future after World War I. Britain tried to maintain pre-war prestige without pre-war strength. Defense budgets were cut in ways that preserved symbols but reduced depth. Navy treaties limited shipbuilding. Investments at home were squeezed to keep up appearances abroad. Governments returned intermittently to the gold standard and then abandoned it. Trying to restore a past that no longer fit the present, colonial administrations focused on keeping order and extracting resources rather than building resilient, diverse economies. Social spending at home grew slowly and unevenly. The state was perpetually short of funds, yet reluctant to admit that its global role needed to shrink to make the books balance. Long-term investments were postponed or abandoned. Railways, housing, and industrial modernization lagged. The empire held on to its shape by quietly consuming resources that should have gone into preparing for the future. Hidden fact 7. The Great Depression cracked the illusion of imperial immunity for decades. British elites believed that empire made them safer from global shocks. Markets were integrated, trade was diversified, currencies and institutions were intertwined. When the Great Depression hit, that belief was tested. Exports collapsed. Unemployment soared in industrial regions tied to global trade. Shipbuilding, coal, textiles, steel. Whole communities in northern England, Scotland, and Wales slid into long-term poverty. In the colonies, demand for raw materials shrank. Local discontent grew. The empire could not insulate itself from a worldwide economic storm. In fact, its complexity amplified the damage. A crisis in one part of the web pulled on every other thread. The idea that imperial reach guaranteed stability died quietly. Replaced by a more anxious reality, the system was fragile, and no one truly controlled it. Hidden fact 8. World War II ended the empire's freedom of choice. The Second World War forced Britain into an all-or-nothing struggle. To defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, it mobilized everything: men, industry, colonies, and credit. That decision was morally understandable and strategically necessary. It was also the final blow to imperial independence. By 1945, Britain was exhausted. Cities like London and Coventry were bombed. Merchant ships lay on the ocean floor. The armed forces were overstretched across Europe, Africa, and Asia. To survive, Britain had relied heavily on American production and loans. Lend-Lease was not charity. It was leverage. When the war ended, the empire was technically on the winning side. In practice, Britain now had to operate within limits set by larger powers, especially the United States. The empire still existed on paper. Its ability to act unilaterally had effectively ended. Hidden Fact 9. Nationalist movements were a response to long patterns, not a sudden fashion. It is easy to tell the story as if colonial subjects woke up after 1945 and suddenly wanted independence. In reality, resistance, reform movements, and demands for self-rule had been building for decades. In India, nationalist organizations had been active since the late 19th century, growing stronger after World War I, and especially after events like the Amritsar massacre. In Ireland, rebellion and partition had already forced the empire to concede major changes. In the Middle East, mandates and protectorates faced growing unrest. In Africa and the Caribbean, intellectuals and workers were slowly building political networks. World War II accelerated these forces. Colonial soldiers fought and died in a war framed around freedom and self-determination. When they returned, being told that those principles did not apply to them was no longer acceptable. The empire did not just lose territories. It lost the legitimacy it needed to pretend that rule was a benevolent service. Hidden Fact 10. Independence often followed crisis. Not calm negotiation. Official narratives sometimes present decolonization as an orderly, planned transition guided by wise leaders in London. The reality on the ground was more chaotic and often violent. India's independence came with partition, mass migrations, and communal bloodshed. Palestine's path out of British control led straight into war. The Malayan emergency, the Momo uprising in Kenya, and unrest in other colonies forced Britain into costly counterinsurgency campaigns. Each crisis weakened public support for empire at home, drained money and manpower, and made the next retreat more likely. The government rarely surrendered authority out of philosophical conversion. It ceded power under pressure, after calculating that the cost of holding on exceeded the benefits. Hidden Fact 11. The Suez Crisis shattered the empire's last illusion of control in 1956. Britain, along with France and Israel, tried to retake the Suez Canal after Egypt nationalized it. The plan assumed that Britain still had the right and the capacity to intervene militarily in a region it had once dominated. The operation succeeded tactically but failed strategically. Under heavy diplomatic and financial pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, Britain was forced to withdraw. The message was unmistakable. The empire could no longer act as a global great power without permission from larger players. Inside Britain, Suez was a psychological turning point. For many, it marked the moment they realized the empire was not just shrinking geographically. It had lost the ability to set the agenda. From that point on, withdrawal and redefinition were no longer optional. They were required. Hidden Fact 12. Sterling's decline made imperial ambitions. Mathematically impossible power is expensive. Maintaining bases, fleets, and garrisons across the world cost money and hard currency. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British pound was the world's key currency, a position that supported imperial reach by making borrowing cheaper and trade easier. Post-war reality was different. Britain's economy was damaged, its gold reserves were limited, and its balance of payments repeatedly slipped into crisis. Keeping the pound strong enough to anchor the old system meant austerity at home and constant negotiations with international lenders, and Institutions. Each sterling crisis narrowed Britain's options. Governments had to choose between domestic recovery and imperial commitments. Over time, the choice became brutally clear. The country could not afford both a modern welfare state and a global empire. The pound's weakness translated directly into the empire's shrinkage. Hidden fact. 13. The empire was quietly swapped for a different kind of status as territories gained independence. Britain pushed a narrative of transformation rather than defeat. The empire became the Commonwealth. Former colonies were recast as equal partners, linked by language, law, and history instead of conquest. This framing softened the shock, but it did not change the underlying fact. The British state no longer controlled these regions' policies, resources, or militaries. It had moved from direct command to influence, still significant, but fundamentally different. At the same time, Britain sought status through other channels: a special relationship with the United States, a nuclear deterrent, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, membership in European structures. The center of gravity moved from imperial governance to diplomacy, finance, and culture. The map shrank. The desire to remain important simply found new outlets. Hidden. Fact 14. The public chose living standards over imperial glory by the mid-20th century. Ordinary British citizens were less interested in holding distant territories and more interested in housing, healthcare, education, and stable work. After the sacrifices of 2 world wars, promises of a better life at home mattered more than prestige abroad. Post-war governments expanded the welfare state, rebuilt cities, and invested in domestic services. These policies cost money. That money had to come from somewhere. One of the few large adjustable spending items was defense and overseas commitments. Bit by bit, budgets reflected this shift. Bases were closed. Forces were withdrawn east of Suez. Politicians who clung to imperial fantasies increasingly sounded out of touch with voters focused on day-to-day survival. In a quiet democratic way, the public helped end the empire by refusing to keep paying for it. Hidden fact 15. Collapse meant losing a story, not losing existence. When people talk about the collapse of the British Empire, it is easy to imagine a cliff edge. One day the sun never sets. The next day the lights go out. That is not what happened. Britain did not vanish. It did not become a failed state. It changed. What collapsed was a story about what Britain was and what it was entitled to do. The belief that a small island could indefinitely direct the affairs of hundreds of millions of people across continents, that ended. The assumption that British currency, law, and military power would always set the tone of world affairs, that ended. What remained was a medium-sized country with a long history, a dense network of international ties, and a need to live within its means. For people who had built their identity around imperial greatness, that felt like humiliation. For those willing to see patterns, it was exactly what history predicts when any empire outruns its resources, confuses reach with strength, and refuses to adjust until adjustment is forced. The British Empire did not fall because of a single enemy or a single mistake. It fell because a long list of small decisions, delayed reforms, and comfortable illusions added up to a structure that could no longer support its own weight. Slow decay prepared the ground. War, debt, and rising resistance delivered the sudden drop. That is the quiet logic underneath every imperial story. The names change. The flag and the language change. The pattern does not.